offered by our university for our undergraduate students and also for our graduate students and the community in general. In the last 3 years, our inaugural classes have been focused on a relevant and up-to-date topic for an international audience. Hence, this year, the serious conflict in the Europe region must be better understood and analyzed by undergraduate, graduate, our students, professors, our technical staff, and the community. I would like to thank you, Dr. Serhy, for joining us and accepting our invitation for this night. I'm sure that your knowledge of the historical and cultural context of Ukraine will help us to understand better this world crisis. Now, I would like to invite our Dean for International Affairs, Dr. Aziz Saliba, for introducing Dr. Serhy.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the members of this virtual table, my colleagues Mauro, Patricia, Lucas, and Barbara for taking, and everybody who is taking part in this event. I also want to thank our distinguished guest, Professor Serhy Yekelchyk, for accepting our invitation to deliver the inaugural address of our minor on international studies. At this moment, no other subject is receiving more attention from the international community than the war against Ukraine. But with all the information about the conflict comes fragmentation, permeated with false narratives and lots of incorrections. And the best thing to do in this case is to turn to specialists. And we have turned to Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk, who received his BA from Kyiv University and an MA from the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Following a research fellowship in Australia in 1993-1994, he went to Canada to pursue a PhD in Russian and Eastern European history at the University of Alberta. His dissertation analyzed the representations of the past in Stalinist culture with a special emphasis on Soviet Ukraine. After graduating, he taught for a year at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor before beginning as a professor at the University of Victoria, from where he has joined us. Professor Yekelchyk has authored numerous books, and I will, however, turn to the book which I think may help more people understand the conflict in Ukraine. It's a book that has been published by Oxford University Press. The first edition, which was advertised in the ad that we ran for this lecture, was called Conflict in Ukraine. The second edition is called Ukraine. And it is perhaps the best introduction you can read about this awful war that is going on and that Dr. Yekelchyk will discuss with us this evening for those of you who are joining us here in Brazil. Professor Yekelchyk, I understand that these are very troubling times for all of us, but they bring a disproportionate burden to all Ukrainians. So many thanks, not only for sharing with us your knowledge, but also for doing that amidst the turbulence of pain and war. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and generous introduction. Thank you also for acknowledging that it is actually indeed for me a personal and a professional issue of interest because I grew up in Ukraine. I still have families there. And for many of us in the field, it is a very difficult issue to deal with a major war starting in our homeland, while also trying to see it as part of global systems and global crises. And this is what really brings me today to your university, the intention to see the war in Ukraine as a global issue in a variety of ways. Because usually when we hear that the war in Ukraine is a global issue, It is seen as part of the context in which the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Russia are competing for influence in Eastern Europe or among the former Soviet republics. It's also sometimes seen as an issue of economic competition in which the European Union and again the Russian economic community, which went through several name changes recently, the Eurasian and such economic bloc, that they are competing for influence, and Ukraine is therefore in between these two forces, both military, political, and economic forces. And this picture is actually very familiar. That's exactly how we portrayed the world during the Cold War. And what was the problem with that picture, with the way the history of the world was taught during the Cold War, was that it actually denied agency to the locals, to those people on the ground for whose allegiances, for whose dollars, for whose armies, the two big blocs were allegedly competing. And this is going to be the starting point of my presentation, that when we deal with really important global issues, which we would typically be prompted to analyze from the point of view of a contest between the two powers, let's take a step back, think about decolonization, and see if we can actually recover the agency of those people on the ground, who are not just the pawns of history to be recruited for one cause or the other, but who actually have their own views, they can vote, they can fight, and so they're entitled to have their voice heard. And this is perhaps the starting point for us to deal with the background to this conflict. Because Russia and Ukraine do share a lot of history. But this is actually true of a great many countries. And it does not necessarily mean that Ukraine needs to be a part of Russia, or that Russia needs to be a part of Ukraine. Because there are two ways of discussing closeness, perhaps even three ways of discussing the close cultural relations between the nations. One would be the imperial one, and historically the oldest. And that's the way in which we imagine one nation as being more civilized, perhaps racially different, arriving to teach the others the lessons of civilization, but the way it is taught is usually accompanied by violence, and therefore civilization, of course, needs to be in quotation marks because it is an imperial myth. I think all of us, as students of world politics, are familiar with this model. When the empire insists on its right to govern the colonial territories without actually asking the colonial nations for their opinion. That's a very familiar moment in global history, which has been experienced many times over. And of course, the story of the 20th century is to a significant degree the story of liberation from that particular hierarchical world in which power is encoded in categories of cultural superiority. So that is one of the ways of discussing it. And we can really see this particular way of discussing the Russian-Ukrainian relations very clearly in recent international events. Before starting the war, the president of Russia, Mr. Vladimir Putin, published a historical article on the website of the president of Russia in several languages, which was entitled "On Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." So he proclaimed that Ukrainians were not really a separate nation, but rather a regional, dialectical group of Russians who constitute the same ethnic larger nation. And therefore, the Ukrainian state had no right to exist because it was an artificial state which separated two parts of the same ethnic group. Now, if it were just a statement like that, you would think in ethnic categories. But even before we consider the importance of ethnic argumentation here, the obvious context has to be examined, and that is the context of the imperial disintegration. Unfortunately, a great many historians and political scientists were accustomed to think of Russia and the Soviet Union as being the same. So in 1990, when suddenly there were two presidents in Moscow, the president of Russia and the president of the Soviet Union, great many Western political scientists were shocked how to explain this to students. And then it turned out that the Soviet collapse took place by way of Russia actually rebelling against the Soviet Union. And Russia, together with other 14 Soviet republics, to the total of 15, actually officially exercised its constitutional right to leave the Soviet Union. All of them have left. The Soviet Union has collapsed. At this moment, interestingly enough, Russia then acted as a nation liberating itself from colonial rule, and that was very much the rhetoric experienced by Russians of the day in the early 1990s. It was a liberation from an oppressive communist empire, which would allow the Russians to actually benefit from the fruits of their labor, from all these natural resources that Russia has and such, without feeding the former Soviet republics, without providing funding and support for the communist movements around the globe, without supporting the former satellite states in Eastern and Central Europe. That was the moment when all the Soviet republics separated from the Soviet Union, and they condemned the Soviet Union as an entity which was oppressive. But interestingly enough, within years following the economic crisis of the 1990s, all of them, even Russia, really, the one which became the formal legal successor of all the Soviet debts, but also very notably all the Soviet property abroad, all these expensive embassy buildings abroad, of the Soviet seat at the United Nations, it inherited all of them. And even Russia, with its enormous prestige and enormous mineral wealth, also armed itself in the 1990s with nationalist rhetoric. But it was a curious nationalist rhetoric. It was not really the defense of the interests of ethnic Russians. It was more of an imperial nostalgia. Very soon, within a decade, the collapse of the Soviet Union was seen by the Russian elites as the source of problems, as an injury to the national pride of Russia, as something which ideally would have been very good to reverse. And here, of course, we arrive at Mr. Putin's infamous statement that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century to him, but not, of course, to the Russians of the early 1990s. For them, it was a moment of liberation. And it's important to understand that it was exactly the same moment for Ukrainians and most other post-Soviet nations. And for them, imperial nostalgia never really came, because for them, the Soviet oppressive empire was just a continuation of a previous entity, the Russian Empire, which officially had the term empire in its name. And so if the Russians went back from that shared moment of democratic excitement, of liberating themselves from oppression, they went back to imperial nostalgia, to thinking that the Soviet Union was fundamentally a good thing for Russia. Then the others didn't. The others continued to evaluate the Soviet Union in those terms. So that would actually explain something about what Mr. Putin sees as the immediate historical developments that caused the current crisis, the separation of the allegedly fraternal people, or perhaps in the case of Ukrainians, even not fraternal, but part of the same people. But here, of course, he goes a bit deeper, because the Soviet Union never really denied that Ukrainians were an independent nation. The Soviet Union claimed that Ukrainians and Belarusians were separate from Russians, had their own peasant customs, own languages, traditions, developed culture, textbooks, newspapers, and the list goes on. So Mr. Putin then goes into something deeper than the Soviet Union. And that deeper background is indeed found in the Russian Empire. Before 1917, the Russian Empire, and that was the official name of it, of course, denied the existence of the Ukrainian ethnic group, claiming that they were a regional dialectical group of the Russian people. And to make sure that Ukrainians agree with this interpretation, the Russian Empire banned publication in the Ukrainian language of everything, including even the musical scores. So this denial then has something to do with the background which is deeper than the Soviets. And it's important for us to understand because Mr. Putin says in this article and also in other off-the-cuff remarks and various press conferences that Lenin is somehow responsible for creating modern Ukraine, which really sounds bizarre to Ukrainians because the Russian Empire did collapse in 1917. When the Russian Empire did collapse, there was a Ukrainian republic created there, which soon united with another Ukrainian republic in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here we have the principle of ethnicity, of ethnic belonging as determining identity and loyalty. It's actually a very important principle for understanding European and world politics of the late 19th and early 20th, not that too much, in the early 20th century, primarily because the disintegration of multinational empires, of dynastic empires, happened at the end of World War I and was combined with the recognition, at least in principle, of national self-determination, the right of compactly settled ethnic groups to govern themselves, to create their own states. Not all of them received such entities at the end of World War I, but the principle was there, and the existence of the Ukrainian Republic created in 1917 was a precedent for Lenin. That was the reason why Lenin and Stalin actually created the Soviet Union as a federation. Even so, Stalin's original idea was to make all these minority regions autonomous within Russia. But Lenin insisted on a federation. And Lenin's reasoning was actually twofold. For one thing, he wanted to make the Soviet state really attractive to the world, especially to the oppressed colonial nations of the Third World, even though the term the Third World was not yet used in his day. But he was very specific. He was particularly interested in Asia, but looked beyond that. And that's the reason why the Soviet Union was created as a federation. But the second one, in order to be able to add more members, but the second one was actually a concession. It was a concession to the peasantry, which the Bolsheviks never quite managed to suppress during the Civil War and the Revolution. Even so, for ideological reasons, they wanted to, because they saw peasants as small-scale capitalists, each of them interested in a land plot. And particularly in Ukraine, which is a major agricultural nation, and we'll talk about that a bit later today, the Bolsheviks had to give peasants various concessions in order to obtain grain from them. And one such concession was actually acknowledging that the peasants speak a different language and that they supported in significant numbers the creation of a Ukrainian republic before the Bolsheviks came. So it was then a very interesting moment of imperial collapse in 1917, with two various ways of addressing the issue of having an ethnic nation, a former part of the empire. What is it entitled to? It really was an important question to social scientists of the day, as you know, and the end of World War I was the moment when the Ukrainians managed to put this important statement in front of the world. But nobody supported them. They tried reaching out to the victorious allies, arguing that it would be important to support the Ukrainian state for strategic reasons, because Bolshevik Russia would not be such a threat to the world if a Ukrainian state would be next to it. And this is basically reproduces the thinking of the Central Powers in World War I, that they needed kind of sanitary cordon sanitaire, or sanitary belt of states between Europe and the Soviet Union. But of course, the Allies decided otherwise. They decided that Poland, the recreated state of Poland, was going to be the center of security and economic arrangement in that part of Europe. And they did not recognize the anti-Bolshevik Ukrainian state. and the Bolsheviks in the end conquered all of Ukraine, creating the own republic as part of the Soviet Union, one of the several republics. But all the decisions were made in Moscow. So here's one way of looking at it, right? That's the imperial entity which disintegrates, but then comes back on a different ideological basis, but essentially trying to recreate, to reclaim all of these territories formerly controlled by the Russian Empire. There was no way for the Bolsheviks to control Poland, because that was one of the main aims of the Allies in World War I, to recreate the Polish Republic. And Finland also managed to get away. Also, eventually, Stalin would try to make war on Finland. But essentially, the Bolsheviks brought back all these ethnic groups of the former Russian Empire. And in so doing, they created the precedent for what is actually my second point, the second possible way of looking at the crisis. And that's the way which Mr. Putin and Russians very often promote. That's a purely ethnic argument, that Ukrainians are not a real ethnic group. There is a Ukrainian language, but the majority of people in Ukraine speak Russian anyway. They are assimilated. They have been assimilated in the Russian Empire, but even more so in the Soviet Union. They're just like Russians. Anyway, even if they don't speak Russian, all of them know Russian. And Russian and Ukrainian are close languages. Well, they aren't really. So, but from the point of view of talking in a hierarchical framework, if you come from the culture ranked higher as an imperial dominant culture, you assume that everybody is going to understand you and respond to you in your language because they must know it. And this is an imperial hierarchy. But this assumption only works one way. It doesn't work the other way. Russians don't speak Ukrainian, because why would they study it, right? If they possess a superior imperial culture. And of course, if you don't know the language and you try speaking it, that's the easiest way to embarrass yourself, by walking into all kinds of situations where words are familiar, but they mean totally different things. I'm sure many of you have had this experience. It's difficult to explain to an English-speaking audience. So my usual example is actually Middle English, spoken in the high Middle Ages. So if you try reading it. But for this particular audience, you know exactly what I mean here. So how do you deal then with the situation when a powerful neighbor, a nuclear power, and a former imperial master tells you that you are part of them, not only because there was never really a Ukrainian state, which is a lie, but also because you are not different in terms of ethnicity, language, and culture? That's an even stronger argument. But of course, this is not an entirely imperial argument. It's an argument which really reached its high point, not at the time of World War I, but at the time of World War II. That's a very recognizable time for a historian of international relations, a recognizable time of the slogan, blood and soil. This is what determines your belonging. And of course, that's precisely the kind of thinking about political communities which was employed by radical right movements in Europe and elsewhere. When Hitler marches into Austria in 1938, himself being, of course, Austrian, right? He claims that Austrians are not really different. They are Austrian Germans, and therefore they belong to a larger German culture. But of course, we no longer live in the mid-20th century. And one would think that after 1945, it's rather difficult to argue based on, blood and soil and belonging being determined by your bloodlines through your parents and by the perhaps even culture you use. So that's the issue. And that issue is particularly interesting in the Ukrainian case, because we realize from the way the invasion unfolded, the early days of the invasion, that the Russian plan was for an easy victory, which would not even require the application of considerable military force, because the original attack was handled by small groups of paratroopers sent on helicopters into the big cities trying to basically capture the presidential administration in Kiev and the Ministry of Defense in the Ukrainian capital, and thinking that, well, if Ukrainians are not a real ethnic group, then they must collapse as soon as we walk in. And this is a particularly strange thinking coming from Russians, because because the state ideology of Mr. Putin's Russia is based on World War II, presented as the great patriotic war of the Russian people, based on the claims that Russians have made a major, and they did actually, a major contribution to destroying Nazi Germany. And, you know, for the nation which is so obsessed with World War II and studies World War II so extensively in history textbooks, the obvious lesson of history is right there in every history textbook for Russian school children. And that is, of course, that the greatest mistake Hitler had made when he decided to attack the Soviet Union in June 1941 was that he thought the Soviet Union was not a real state. It was controlled by whatever group in Hitler's crazy racial imagination, but he thought, as soon, he actually says, and it was recorded repeatedly by various aides, ended up in Hitler's table talks and other publications, that as soon as you kick in the door with your boot, the entire building will collapse, the roof will cave in, and the building will collapse. So he didn't believe in the Soviet Union being a viable state. And now Putin walks into Ukraine based on that very same assumption. That is at least strange, to be so propagandized by your own propagandistic version of history, so as even not to examine the foundations of your neighbor's identity. And of course, as all the major media around the world have been reporting, these expectations were entirely without base, without rational explanation, because Ukraine does have a very significant ethnic Russian population. But that does not mean that these people by default would support an oppressive dictatorship which is increasingly separated from the world. Ukraine also has a very significant number of people who, at census time, identify as ethnic Ukrainians, but those who speak Russian at home, plenty of them, especially in big cities, especially in the big cities in the eastern part of Ukraine. But these people too, somehow, in Mr. Putin's mind, the Russian definition of compatriots includes actually the Russian-speaking population of the former Soviet republics. So it's culture-based in a peculiar way. But these people too were not particularly eager to bring flowers to Mr. Putin's soldiers. Instead, they went on to fight against him. So he is still unable to capture the city of Kharkiv, the closest Ukrainian city to the Russian border in eastern Ukraine, which is now reduced literally to ruins. But that's almost an entirely Russian-speaking city. And also, the only more or less significant city which was captured by the Russian troops is the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine. That too is the city where I don't remember ever hearing anybody speak Ukrainian on the streets. It's basically a Russian-speaking city. But it turned out that, of course, Russian culture does not mean that you automatically become a citizen of Mr. Putin's state. You can disagree with Russian politics, and of course, the Russian politics is a very peculiar kind of politics. No opposition in the parliament, no opposition in media, journalists getting killed, oppositional politicians getting poisoned. There is a long list there, right? And of course, Russia is increasingly separated from the world. It's becoming difficult to travel. The state actually just yesterday went after university professors, making it easier to dismiss university professors with Western connections, actually, extending the Russian law on foreign agents to include university instructors and making it particularly easy to fire them. So that's not, it's not exactly the place you would want to be, and especially not the so-called People's Republics, because everybody knows the example of the Donbas People Republic and Donetsk and Luhansk People Republics, two People's Republics created during the previous conflict, when in 2014 Russia attacked Ukraine and used the separatist movement in two eastern regions to basically create two puppet states with curious Soviet-style names of people's republics, suggesting some kind of return to the Soviet Union. But really, they became the black holes because there is no meaningful economies. You need to get for your kids Ukrainian IDs in order for them to graduate school and go to the university. There are all kinds of issues. So people have been leaving those people's republics and nobody wants to be in the People's Republic anymore. And so when the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine was taken, the locals started rallying in Central Square, chanting in Russian that they are part of Ukraine. So they didn't want to be, and they still don't want to be part of a new People's Republic, a new black hole for the economy and education and everything. So what does it tell us? The lesson I thought was fairly obvious after 1945. You cannot really play this ethnic card, not only because modern identities are more complex, modern communities are really political, but also because by so doing, you promote ethnic strife and you actually create a conflict rather than build the bridges for the future. And then there is, of course, the third way, and the final one I'm going to discuss here. The third way of looking at Ukrainian-Russian relationship is actually the one which is very appropriate for the 21st century. And that's the way of seeing both countries as political communities. But of course, here lies the problem for Mr. Putin. He doesn't really want to acknowledge that Russia and Ukraine are two different political communities. And the reason for that is not imperial and not really ethnic radicalist either. But the reason here is found in his authoritarian politics. He really is at war with Ukraine because he is also at war with his own people. Because Ukraine went through two democratic revolutions in the 21st century. The Orange Revolution of 2004 and 5, and then the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 2014. Both started as mass rebellions in the center of the Ukrainian capital, on the main square. Both were spontaneous. In the first case, caused by a falsified presidential election and an attempt to poison an oppositional candidate. In the second case, by the Ukrainian authorities giving up to the blackmail from Russia and announcing literally the night before an agreement with the European Union was to be signed, that they were withdrawing from the negotiation process and instead they were going to join the Russian-led economic union. And then turns out that Ukrainian citizens during the period of independence created a mobilized society in which people stand up to the authorities and they are not afraid of the police or even the army. And they also know that they would be supported by a very significant number of other citizens who would show up or would fundraise, would help drive people to the rally sites and such. So there is in the Ukrainian society a real civic society, a real possibility for people to mobilize and insist that the authorities must do this or that. But of course, this thing is totally absent in Mr. Putin's Russia. And he really doesn't want to allow it to develop. In 2011 and 2012, there were massive rallies of protest in major Russian cities, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two most important ones, but also in other large cities where you get younger professionals who travel a lot and who have very good access to the internet. And since then, of course, Russian authorities have been cutting access to the internet. And then the protests were against Mr. Putin's continued rule when everybody realized that his plan was actually to stay in power forever, to be president for life. Initially, the plan was actually to change seats with Dmitry Medvedev by becoming prime minister and allowing Medvedev to serve as president. But then that was scrapped. And instead, they decided to rewrite the constitution to allow Putin to stay in power for however many terms he wanted and he would last. And that caused the protests on the streets. And the Russian elites were really scared because they thought it was becoming like Ukraine. The society was going to mobilize and that would become a revolution. And therefore they brutally suppressed these protests. And they also became determined not to allow a successful Ukraine next door to become an example to any Russian discontented citizens. So Mr. Putin then used the page from Stalin's book. Stalin very famously worked to create an atomized society, which wouldn't have any horizontal level of organization between individuals and the state, to keep the individuals individually responsible before the government. Therefore, if you see people protesting in Russia occasionally on television, they stand one by one, not next to each other, because if you stand next to each other, you are a group, and it's totally different criminal punishment. If you are one person and you're holding the poster, you will still be arrested, but it would be an administrative offense rather than a criminal offense or political offense. So that's the kind of society Mr. Putin was trying and is working very hard to create. Therefore, the victory of the second revolution in Ukraine in 2014 was for him the moment to send a really important signal. A signal that this cannot possibly happen in Russia. And that was really the foundation behind his moves to start the war in the Donbass by supporting the local separatist forces and to occupy the Crimea at the same point. The Crimea is a very vulnerable part of Ukraine in this respect because it, during the post-World War II period, had the Russian majority, and Ukrainian culture was never really established on the Crimean Peninsula. But that does not mean, of course, that Crimea is Russian, because the majority of Crimean Russians moved in following the genocidal deportation of the Crimean Tatars, who truly are the Aboriginal people, if we can find any, the Aboriginal people of the Crimea. So it's basically a colonial genocide which enabled the creation of a Russian enclave in Ukraine, Crimea. Donbass was different. But you see, Mr. Putin's big aim was actually to destroy Ukraine, not to make it a successful example of country in which presidents actually change, in which citizens actually matter, and there are all kinds of NGOs and other networks. But when approaching this task, he used the instruments from two previous models I have discussed earlier in my talk, the imperial model and the ethnic model of the mid-20th century. But essentially that means then that it is the past that is fighting the future here, because the Ukrainian nation as it exists now, the most recent revolution was started by a journalist in a Facebook post, by a journalist whose name is Mustafa. He's Afghani, who actually repeatedly was arrested by Ukrainian police because of racial profiling, and even beaten up before he became famous and member of the parliament. And of course, the most recognizable victim of this revolution was an Armenian Ukrainian. And now Ukraine has a Jewish president. And that's a pretty strong signal that we are not in Ukraine, really in the age of radical ethnic nationalism. Also, Russia really is trying very hard to make this point. And of course, there is radical right in Ukraine, as it is elsewhere in the world, and actually in power in Russia too. But it is actually something else that unites these people. It has to be political. It is the community, which is a community of political choice, which is defined as democracy and Europe. And I think my last comment in this lecture is going to be this. Very often we hear that the motto of the Ukrainian movement, we are part of Europe, is progressive. But isn't it really different? Would it not be that by claiming part of Europe, you're joining the colonial world? You're positioning yourself above other groups. But of course, my explanation right away is that it is a metaphor. Ukrainians have very little experience with the European Union. I'm sure as soon as they start experiencing this enormous bureaucracy and all kinds of quotas on production and import and export and everything, they will have a different notion of Europe. And we can see it already now, really, when there are voices in domestic political debates that the European Union should really be proud that we want to join it. And the second aspect of it, NATO. The Ukraine was never really given an accession status to the European Union until during this war. Previously, the European Union rejected Ukrainian initiatives. NATO never considered Ukraine a potential candidate. It all existed on the pages of Russian media only. The only time NATO has actually considered the issue of Ukrainian and Georgian membership was in 2008, and it was decisively rejected, never raised since. So when Ukraine uses the concept of becoming part of the European Union, becoming part of the NATO, it's not because it is NATO expansion and encroachment on the traditional territories of Russian political influence. It's because Ukraine defines itself in the opposition to the Russian model, which is ethnic and authoritarian. It's ethnic in the worst possible sense of this word, kind of in Hitler-Mussolini terms, and it is authoritarian. And so the opposite of Russia is an idealized democracy and Europe, and that's precisely the reason why Ukraine defines it this way. But of course, and this is my last comment here, after so many years of talking about joining the NATO in order to be protected against the Russian aggression, the very popular meme on Ukrainian social media these days is that the NATO should be happy if we join them, because we are the ones who have demonstrated we can fight for our freedom, for our identity, which is not defined as ethnic or anything. It's a democratic community. And so if we do join NATO, we would be the strongest element of NATO, regardless of how many multiple rocket launchers we have. So that's the three big points on which I wanted to elaborate in my introductory comments, and I'll be more than happy to take questions, and I'll try to be a bit shorter. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor, for your brilliant presentation and for all the topics that you have discussed here now with us. It's a lot of points that we should think about and putting deep the discussion about the relationships in a historical and cultural perspective. So once again, the minor in international studies, Professor Aula, with your inaugural class this night. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask my colleagues, Professor Patricia, Professor Lucas, and Professor Barbara, if you'd like to ask some questions, or if the audience have some questions. I think we have time for some discussion. Didn't we?
Lucas, may I start?
Yes, please, Patricia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your excellent presentation. I have a lot of questions because the topic's very interesting and also difficult for us to understand, even if we teach and research and study international relations. And one point that I want to highlight that is very, very interesting for us to understand more, and as you explained for us, it became clear, is that the power of the young people of the society in the protests, mass protests that are happening even before the 90s and in the beginning of the 20s, and the last one in 2013, as you well explained, it was something that was very impressive for us here in Brazil and in other countries of the West. So this is something that you explained for us a lot, that has to do with the culture, the history, the formation of the nation, the relations historical relations between Ukraine and Russia. So this is a very interesting issue that I could understand more. Thank you. But my question as a professor of international relations and more specific about the broad picture that we can try to understand from this very this war and this invasion is about the relations between Ukraine and the West from now on. I think that, sure, we cannot try to see the future, but if we can see that this war be prolonged, more prolonged, as we are seeing that it will be, what I can see that Ukraine has become even more and more frustrated with the US, the European Union, and the West partners and other West partners' answers to this invasion. And even this happened, this began even before this war. And US and the European Union were taken as models of democracy, respect of law, and economic transparency, especially from the 90s. And since the early 2000, Ukraine expects to be part of as the European Union of the NATO, as you explained the last part of the presentation. And as far as can understand, the US and the European Union had failure to live this example. How can we see the near future of the relations between Ukraine and the West if these expectations are not reached? I think that it's a broad question, but if you can explain or give us more insights, I will appreciate. Thank you.
Professor Patricia, this is an excellent question. Thank you so much. Because we don't know the answer yet, but we do know that you are right. And how we know that is because there is a mounting frustration in Ukraine, particularly towards the larger political frameworks of the European Union and NATO, because they're very slow to move, and they want to have the consensus of all the neighbors, of all the members of these networks. And Ukrainians imagined them to be as kind of really radical advocates of whatever they understand as freedom in Ukraine. But the problem is that at the moment, it became very clear that the member states of the European Union took so long to even issue any concerted statements or any apply any sanctions to Russia, that countries that are not members of the European Union, in a way, were much faster to act. And the best example here is, of course, the United Kingdom, which is problematic for a variety of respects. So there are plenty of people very unhappy with the administration of Boris Johnson and have strong views about his whatever internal and foreign politics, but he's now such a huge hero in Ukraine. There are drawings circulated on email of him being dressed as a knight in shining armor, the protector of Ukraine. And everybody writes, God save the Queen, because they were the first to truly, strongly support Ukraine. So I think what this indicates is there is a problem. And that's precisely the problem you have identified, that Ukrainians saw the notions of Europe and NATO as metaphors of everything that is opposite to Russia. This must be the kind of world in which there is no corruption, there is a rule of law, there are decent politicians, there is equal economic opportunity, everything you can imagine. But they are now slowly discovering that this is not necessarily the case. And these disillusionments can be quite painful. And at the moment, we only have the signals that Ukrainians are discovering the West is not ideal. Now, what this is going to produce soon is a good question. At the moment, for instance, Ukrainians realize that Germany is very slow supporting Ukraine, not just because Germany, of course, went through this entire educational exercise of we have caused World War I, we have caused World War II, we should never again arm a party in a major conflict. but also because Germany doesn't have any significant heavy military equipment. It would have to order it. And whereas everybody, of course, in Ukraine imagined Europe being such a formidable military power, it really isn't. And there are all kinds of tensions and problems and bureaucratic issues, and actually corruption as well within Europe, which Ukrainians are now discovering. So you completely correctly identified the problem. The problem is right there. There is no answer yet of what it would produce. But there is one tiny footnote which is very promising. It is not just Russia that is a former imperial master of Ukraine, but it is also Poland. Poland for centuries included significant parts of Ukraine, and that formed certain kind of cultural expectations. Well, you know, Ukrainians, they're sort of brutal, they are simple people. It's almost like racial difference, the degrees of whiteness, perhaps a scholar of race would say, that they are also Europeans, but they're not quite as civilized as Poles. In recent decades, Poland was using Ukrainians as free labor, as cheap labor, really, because so many Ukrainians went abroad to work there. And there were multiple instances of racism and discontent and deteriorating relations between Poland and Ukraine. But what happened with that particular Russian attack was that it was actually not so much the Polish government. The Polish government did a good job, but it is actually the individual Poles who accepted Ukrainians into the homes. And that created a very new understanding that, okay, we don't like your government. Your government thinks our heroes are bad people, and actually your heroes are, in fact, bad people. There are all kinds of historical issues, as with Russia. But there is suddenly now a demonstration that ordinary Poles are your family. Because there was this moment when the Commission of the European Union arrived to examine the camps for refugees in Poland, and of course they were told that there are no camps for refugees in Poland, because all the Ukrainians were taken into Polish families at the first stage. I actually have a distant relative of my wife's who is now in Poland, and she's completely blown away, really, by this. We never expected Poles to be such good people. So I guess here comes something really important, with understanding that we are the civil society which can, you know, stand up to aggression and empire. But also we are discovering in other countries similar types of humanitarian appeal and similar types of networks. And that would be a really good future, not just European, but, you know, global future, if people and NGOs could cooperate directly and help refugees this way. It's a dream.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Lucas, I think you asked for a question.
Thank you, Professor Mauro. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet again Professor Aziz Saliba, Professor Barbara, and Professor Patricia. And it's very interesting to hear you, Professor Yekelchyk. And thank you and congratulations on your thought-provoking and crystal clear lecture on deeply intricate issues that we are reading in the newspapers, but it's quite different when an expert offered us a so brilliant lecture as you did. It was a pleasure to hear and learn from you. I deeply appreciated your description of this war. It is the war of a past fighting the future, and that is a quite good description, I think, also from the field of international law. On the first days of war, Professor Aziz Saliba and I, we wrote an open-ed piece on a newspaper in Brazil, saying that in a first analysis, the arguments used by Russia to legitimize use of force were quite weak, and the scenario didn't change since there. And I have an observation to what you said and the question. The observation is this, and it comes from a viewpoint of international lawyer. it's interesting the use of history in this war, because there are no legal arguments, there are no threats of mass destruction. The Putin letter of 24th of February, you can see that there are an attack to the West, but also some arguments, some imperialist arguments that you revealed to us more clearly. And this is quite interesting because there is an effect also to history, because there is an effect on the recent history. If you invoke this imperial 19th century history, you are condemning the history of the recent history of the Ukrainian people to oblivion, especially its independence, its political processes, and so on and so forth. And this consequence for the legal order is that you have an attack to what was decided in 1945, no acquisition of territory using force, and you are at some point contesting the recent history and the recent global order. And why this is why your lecture was so interesting for us in this regard. But my question is one specific argument that appears in Mr. Putin's and the official Kremlin's discourse that regards the denazification of Ukraine. Because everything is connected to a certain past, to a certain ethnic and imperial pretension. I'm not saying that this is convincing. I am quite convinced by your arguments. But this question of the denazification of Germany is quite strong. And while the Kremlin and Moscow has changed some positions regarding genocide, for instance, at a certain point they were alleging genocide, they are not alleging anymore, or not so strongly. The question of denazification is still strong. These groups in Ukraine, the Azov battalion, how do you perceive all this use of this argument and what's happening in Ukraine in this regard? If you clarify this for us, it would be quite useful. And thank you very much for your lecture. It was really brilliant.
Thank you so much. Very good observations. I agree with you. Yes. This Nazification argument is actually quite puzzling because it has been applied to the wrong government. It really was devised by Russia to be applied to the previous administration in Ukraine, the administration of President Poroshenko, who did try to mobilize nationalistic version of history in order to build a stronger identity which is opposite to that of Russia. But of course, that's the wrong precedent. He was defeated in 2019. He was defeated in a landslide precisely because people thought that that was not the way to go. And so now suddenly applying these charges to the government of President Zelensky, who is himself, as we know, of Jewish background and a Russian speaker. Also, he's very good with languages. So he by now speaks very good Ukrainian and actually making wonderful progress in English as well. So apparently he's good with languages. But the thing is, I mean, it sounds like Russia has to declare anybody who is opposed to the Russian model a Nazi. Because in the Russian vision of World War II, the West is really not on the Russian side. The West is on the side of the Nazi Germany. And how could that possibly be achieved? Is by way of identifying with Nazism something we call democracy. So that would require me to go into a much deeper explanation of how the Russian political discourse works. But of course, Russia no longer identifies with socialism at all. So it is very naive of some of my leftist friends in the West to be supporting the Russian cause just because Russia is anti-American. Russia is, of course, a self-proclaimed stronghold of the extreme Christian right. That's the official position of the Russian government, that they are the only truly conservative Christian government on earth. From that position, really claiming the Soviet heritage also becomes problematic because they don't like Lenin at all. They really only like Stalin because Stalin acquired nuclear weapons. Stalin showed the West its place, that we are so strong, that we are stronger than the West and such. So Stalin is a great dictator, but not Stalin as a communist. So the Russian version of history is not what it appears to be. It is instead a very skillful appropriation of the good moments from the Soviet history that they like victory over Nazism. But this appropriation is achieved by completely suppressing the enormous history of the Russian collaboration. Because Russia had an extensive history of collaboration with the Nazis. In fact, there was the entire Russian army fighting on Hitler's side, called the Russian Liberation Army. The number of Russians in the police and in the Cossack units of the Hitler's army was enormous. But of course, this is all completely suppressed. You can't talk about that the same way you cannot talk about the war crimes of the Red Army when the Red Army was marching into Germany. And for instance, the much talked about war crime, which you probably know about, is the mass rape of German women, of millions and millions of German women, which was the first documented case in modern history of mass rape being applied as an instrument of war, which since then has been documented in various other conflicts as well. But this is completely denied in Russia. So if we try to publish an op-ed about the mass rape, the Russian ambassador in the country would send a letter saying to the newspaper saying it never happened, it's all fake. So the Russian public is conditioned to understand as fake whatever doesn't fit the official interpretation. And so the Russian official interpretation of Ukraine is that Ukrainians were Nazi collaborators. But that's not what in fact took place, because the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians fought in the Red Army. So they were actually on the Soviet side. For the overwhelming majority, the experience was either fighting in the Red Army or waiting for the fighters to come back home. It's only in a small western part of Ukraine there was a nationalistic resistance, and it was actually a very complex story, not a simple one, the way it is presented in the Russian propaganda. Suffices to say that the Ukrainian insurgent army, which was created in 1943, actually fought both the Germans and the Soviets, really. So it's a complex story. It does not excuse Ukrainian collaboration, because every nation should address the issue of what we were doing, what we were thinking, what kind of slogans we were printing in our newspapers during World War II, right? Because it's up to us to. But of course, it's designed as a certain image in order to make West and the very notion of democracy associated with Nazism. So that's why the Russian government actually really tries very hard to implicate any dissidents in connections with the West, or any dissidents with the Nazi interpretation of history, to connect them somehow to the Nazis, because they want to connect the countries that now have a more humanistic reading of the war. For instance, in Ukraine, the end of the war is celebrated as the day of memory and reconciliation, as in many countries too, because there were conflicts within your own nation, there were killings to which you were perhaps collaborators. All of this are ultimately a tragedy which needs to be discussed. Whereas Russia celebrates it only as victory. Like, there is no moment of civilian victims. There is no moment of reevaluating the past and the brutality. It's all the victory of the state. And tellingly, it is also on a different date. It's not May 8th, but May 9th. Which originally was because of the time difference between Berlin and Moscow. But now it became, because the news was received of the unconditional surrender of Germany when it was already past midnight in Moscow. But now it became an ideological thing, because on May 9th, you celebrate a totally different narrative in the war. The narrative of the great Stalin, humanist soldiers who never killed anybody and such, never raped anybody, right? Never looted. And so it's a different way of remembering the war, but the Putin regime is encoded in it. And in fact, a very popular motto on Russian social media is that we can do it again, repeated over and over again. And you could see it written on the tanks in the current conflict with Russia. We can do it again, meaning we can invade Europe again. But why would you invade Europe? Well, the answer is obviously because Europe must be Nazi. All of them are Nazis. Therefore, we can do it again and invade and quote unquote liberate it. So it's an enormously complicated issue, but it's actually a discursive political strategy.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Can I ask a question, please? Yeah. Now, first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor, for this enlightening talk. It was really interesting. I appreciate your time and also the way that you managed your talk. It was thorough, and you also managed to give us a bird's eye view on issues that are quite complex, and you somehow simplify it for us and for our students. So thank you so much for that. I thought it was really interesting, and I would like to see if you could develop this a little bit further. When you mentioned that this ethnic card has been played quite often, you also mentioned this superior culture and also language superiority as well as also being played around in different ways. I was thinking, what are the implications for the future, especially for the young generation, if you could connect that to everything that you said regarding to the ethnic card and also to the language superiority and culture?
Thank you. That's a great question, actually, because it brings me back to the point with which I have started, but which I have largely ignored in the rest of my talk. And that's the decolonization moment in Europe and around the world. Because Ukrainians are very lucky to have a European example in Ireland in particular, but also to a degree in Scotland, where the original native language, which was erased for centuries, and the identity was erased for centuries as well, now being reclaimed as part of a modern European identity, which is understood to be based on human rights. So if it's based on human rights, then it matters. And then it becomes possible to look at various shades of capitalism and colonialism. And when we do that, then very clearly can see that there is a movement to revive the Aboriginal languages around the world, really. Right here in Canada, my university actually is world famous for its program of revitalization of Aboriginal languages in Western Canada. And we also have the first chair of Aboriginal law in Canada as well. So really big on this. And so this goes on around the world. And when it arrives in Europe, would you assume that Europe is all kind of white, empowered, privileged? And then the Irish example shows that maybe not. And so many universities in the United Kingdom now have bilingual websites in Gaelic. So when you go to look for somebody, and the website tells you, you are welcome to write to us in that language too, because it's really important for us to revitalize this. And what is happening there, I think, is the rewriting of the age of so-called progressive capitalism, the 19th century, this whole narrative of progress, which came together with racism, with exploitation, with the worst excesses of capitalism, with child labor, all kinds of things that we now think are happening around the world, were in fact happening in Europe as well. And so there is the moment when we start addressing our role in this decolonization moment, it's an important one, because once we make the claim, we then should also address our own legacy as part of the empire. And it's really important to Ukrainians. And it's really similar to the role of Scots in the United Kingdom, because as an individual, you could be part of the empire. Maybe you speak with an accent, but it's okay. It's kind of nice accent, whatever, friendly, sexy accent. James Bond speaks with Scottish accent. It's okay, right? And the same with Ukrainians. So you could reach the highest social networks in the empire. You could become the chancellor of the empire, whatever. But as a member of the group, you could still be disadvantaged because you would not be able to practice your language or customs. because the church went after your customs. And this is a very colonial narrative, very familiar one, right? The role of the church. And so it actually means that Europe needs to recover a lot. I'm sorry for my European colleagues, but there is so much work here to do. And it also involves social things too. The Irish famine, which was, many people believe, a genocidal famine of the 19th century, the one which resulted in so many Irish living around the world now. Famine doesn't really happen in democracy, an important political figure said. It happens in other systems. And of course, in that particular case, like in Ukraine, which also went through a colossal famine in the 1930s, and that was definitely was state created, not just enabled, but actually engineered by the state. It's also the issue of social identity. You wouldn't want to speak about it sometimes in Ireland because that would acknowledge that your ancestors were poor peasants. Right? So it becomes an issue of how do you recover your past if it is the past which is associated with stigma and trauma, and at the same time as you look at your own role as colonizer. So I think it's the ultimate lesson for the world is, we should all acknowledge that it's more than we thought. Like the recent discovery of graves, the residential schools here in Canada, a colossal issue, of course, at the same time happening as the Black Lives Matter in the US, which was an important moment for the world. Here in Canada, the Aboriginal communities discovered unmarked graves of the children put by the church into the residential schools, and not even buried as individuals, but basically put into this pit. And this started such an important discussion here in Canada. And more generally, the Pope in Vatican became involved. He issued an official apology. And here we thought that in Canada, we have already settled our account with colonial past by acknowledging, but no, there is more. And there is more at so many levels. And coming after this Me Too movement, which throughout the world forced us to acknowledge violence against women, which became a redefining moment for the culture of the 21st century. So we find ourselves at this moment that, well, it is never going to be enough because we need to look for more, any shades of inequality, any shades of oppression, disadvantagement, of violence. It was associated with ideologies of the past, and we need to uncover them as we go on because it's impossible to build a modern world without discussing them all. And I think the Ukrainian war, in a way, is a moment which alerted us to the fact that you can have a genocide in the 1930s in a country where there is no racial difference. And in fact, there is almost no, according to the empire, ethnic difference. And yet, Stalin organized a genocidal famine in the 1930s because he wanted to crush the resistance of the peasantry. Wow, but that sounds like you're dealing with a disadvantaged social class. You are attacking it. We can look at it from the point of view of a nation. We can look at it at the point of view of a social group. We start looking at what peasant women did and how they suffered the worst of it. And our history will never be the same. And I'm afraid we went through several defining moments in the last 2 decades that taught us a big lesson.
Mauro, may I ask perhaps the last 2 questions? We have, I know that we have exceeded the time that we had promised Serhy that would keep him here, but there's just so many interesting things that we would like his takes on. I will focus on 2 issues here. In the beginning of the conflict, Putin stated very broad goals, I will quote here, to protect the people that are subjected to abuse, genocide from the Kiev regime for 8 years, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and put to justice those that committed numerous bloody crimes against peaceful people, including Russian nationals. End of quote. After more or less a month, the Russian Minister of Defense announced that it would then focus on securing Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, which is quite a change to the initial stated goals. The other fact that I would like to bring to light happened this week. The US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the US wants to see Russia weakened to the point where it can't do things like invade Ukraine. And today, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has warned that the conflict in Ukraine risked escalating into a third world war, and that NATO was in essence engaged in a proxy war with Moscow by supplying Kyiv with weapons. And Lavrov also said that the risk of a nuclear conflict should not be underestimated, and that the core of any agreement to end the conflict in Ukraine would depend largely on the military situation on the ground. So these are very conflicting facts, I would say. And I would like to know from you, Serhy, I know that, of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but in your view, what will be, or what is Putin's endgame? You mentioned that he wants a weaker Ukraine, that he doesn't want Ukraine to succeed as a democratic model, as an alternative to his more authoritarian Russia. So what is his endgame? I mean, what will he consider like in sufficient to call perhaps good enough for to end this conflict? That's the first question. The second question is there a risk of this war escalating, or is that more an empty threat in your view? With that, I would like to thank you once again very much for the excellent lecture. Hope I get to see you in Brazil soon, and that we get to see peace in Ukraine even sooner.
Thank you so much, Aziz. So, well, Russia is getting desperate. I'm afraid it's what all about. But here, we need to distinguish between the Russian elites and Mr. Putin, because he has no end game. He started this war expecting an easy victory, and after he had to move in so many troops in order to even try to do anything with Eastern Ukraine, and these troops were being saved for something else, for potentially controlling the western part of Ukraine. His plan A has failed, his plan B has failed. Now he is on his plan C to secure the two provinces that constitute the Donbas region, and possibly also another one in the south, ideally to provide a land bridge to the Crimea. But that's sort of very different from this whole rhetoric of denazification and demilitarization that just reveals these things do not work together all that well. And that means that we deal with a very particular, well, I'm not a political scientist, but some of you are. We deal with a very particular political model, which I think is called charismatic dictatorships, in which it's not really important for Mr. Putin to win the elections, but it is important for him to be loved by Russians, to be admired for his kind of macho appeal. And that's why he is photographed bare-chested. And in some other countries, of course, populist politicians also go for this public appeal. So if they lose it, that's the problem. Whether they lose the elections or not, Putin cannot possibly lose the elections because everything is fixed in Russia politically. But what if he suffers defeat after defeat? That itself can really be a major factor for perhaps a coup against him instituted by the Russian elites. So he walked in without the plan, fully believing his own propaganda like Hitler did. He believed that the Russian propaganda was the truth. And he is now slowly realizing that Russian propaganda was only Russian propaganda. He cannot acknowledge it publicly because acknowledging this publicly would be showing a weakness. And the charismatic macho leader who is photographed, fishing and riding horses by a chest at he cannot possibly acknowledge a defeat. So that's the problem. It's a problem, first of all, for Ukraine and for Ukrainian civilians, because so far the Russian reaction to that was to apply more firepower, to bombard the cities indiscriminately, and also to use very old bombs. Russia is close to running out of the so-called precision rockets. The American intelligence apparently estimates that about 60% of Russian precision rockets are not at all precise, not even close to being precise. So in the city of Mariupol, which is now besieged and almost erased from the face of the planet, Russia is now using very old bombs from the 1940s and 50s. Lots of them do not even explode, but they're so huge. Now, of course, it so happened that the last defenders of Mariupol are now hiding in the underground city, which was designed as a nuclear shelter in case of a nuclear war. So nothing can possibly get there, no matter how many bombs you drop on that particular area. But I mean, for the rest of it, for the civilians, it's going to be very cruel, I'm afraid, right? So in addition to the atrocities which the Russian troops committed, basically imitating Berlin 1945, and the Russian army looted and raped and killed everybody as it went to occupy Nazi Germany. In addition to that, there is actually the Russian way of making war, which we have seen in Syria recently, basically erasing the cities from the face of the planet. And that's what they do. That still doesn't bring them any close to any end point, I'm afraid, right? And at this point, I think the West has realized that, okay, so we waited the first week to see whether Ukraine is going to collapse. Ukraine did not collapse. Fine. Now we provided the weapons. Now the war is switching to a different stage in which it's mostly the open prairies where they're fighting. So they need different types of weapons. They need more tanks and heavy artillery and such. The reality is, unfortunately, and I say so with pain, Ukraine can sustain a very long war because it has a morale. It can be fighting for 10 years if need be. Millions would die, but it would keep fighting. And now Russia finds itself in a stalemate from which there is no exit. If the West continues to provide the weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine is very soon going to start defeating the Russian troops. There is no plan D because Putin really doesn't want to declare mass mobilization within Russia, because he remembers how the last Russian war ended, in which the conscripts were used for that, the war in Afghanistan, when the organization of soldiers martyrs became like the most powerful democratic organization in the country and contributed to destroying the Soviet Union. So the war can go on for years and years. Ukraine will sustain enormous damage and casualties, but it has the morale. It will be fighting. What happens if Mr. Putin calls for mass mobilization in Russia? I am not so sure, really. That he also wants to be a charismatic leader who wants to see a victory, as you said very rightly. He wants to see a victory. So what can he possibly present as a victory? At some point, maybe a week ago, some political analysts felt that maybe taking Mariupol, all of it, including this Azov regiment, which was originally, when it was established, affiliated with the right-wing neo-Nazi movement. But of course, now it's a totally different composition of this regiment. But still, it has in the Russian media, at least, such a reputation. So maybe, taking Mariupol, killing or taking prisoner all this Azov people from Mariupol would be celebrated as the great victory. But then it turned out that Russians suffered such an enormous losses in fighting and the Azov regiment is now in this underground place under a major steel factory, which was designed to sustain whatever nuclear bomb. So that denies him that victory, and it looks very likely that he isn't going to get any more victories on the battlefield, because clearly the Ukrainian army is now in the waiting mode, fighting hard, slowly retreating one village by the other, basically inflicting as much damage as possible on the Russian troops, because soon the heavy artillery and the tanks are going to arrive, and the American rockets, which have the range of 500 kilometers. And Russia is going to lose this wonderful advantage which they liked so much, that they can, attack anything and anybody with rockets without even crossing the border. American style of war, essentially. There is no easy solution. Now, there were negotiations held most recently in the Turkish capital of Istanbul that were quite productive on some points. But then the Ukrainian government tried selling the terms to the domestic audience, and it received a united response, no. Even not just no, but hell no, like no way, not after all the atrocities, not after all these people died. And there was apparently also some pressure from the Americans and European allies on Ukrainians, which nobody wanted to talk about, to settle with some kind of peace deal. But because it has no support in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian society, according to the polls, continues to be united and believing in the victory, like there is no endpoint in sight at all, which would allow Mr. Putin to claim any sort of victory. And that makes me very concerned. Like all of us are hoping really in the field that the Russian elites are still powerful enough to remove Mr. Putin. But that does not appear to be the case. In the last decade in particular, he cleansed the immediate circle, and the entire elite around him depends on him. And there is no opposition in the country, really. There is this Navalny person who was poisoned and who is now in prison. But really, there is no organized oppositional movement. There is no free internet now, even. Like, there is no platform to create a different Russia. So I don't just quite see how this is going to end. I'm really scared, I have to say. Now, I don't believe that Mr. Putin would use nuclear weapons. But the fact that this is being raised over and over again by all kinds of Russian authorities, the Russian military, the Russian foreign affairs, and Mr. Putin himself, indicates that they are desperate. There is no end game. They don't know what to do. They sort of hope that if you threaten with a nuclear bomb, then maybe Ukrainians agree to give up on the 2 provinces or whatever, at least something. But Ukrainians cannot, because there is no popular support for that. If President Zelensky attempts to do this, he will be probably removed in a coup, because there's such a strong popular support for the idea of fighting till the end and basically defeating the Russian army. So the thing is, Ukraine can defeat the Russian army in a conventional war, or the war can go on for many years, or Mr. Putin just can be removed by somebody from the Russian elites. We are not seeing that yet. And I actually don't know what the future holds. The only thing I have to say is that the cost to Ukraine is going to be enormous, like in any outcome, other than Mr. Putin committing suicide tomorrow. Like any other outcome. And that's why so many protesters here in Canada carry the poster, "Can we fast forward to the moment when you kill yourself in the bunker like Hitler?" Because obviously, the moment Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he was doomed. He was going to lose the war, but it took 5 years and millions of victims, right? So can we fast forward to that moment? But no, there is no solution, and it's very scary.
Dr. Serhy, I think our Office of International Affairs had a very good way in our inaugural class this night here in Brazil, because this war, it's topic of concern for all the global community, and also for us here. We are all very concerned about the Ukrainian population. We are all very sad about this situation, and we put this discussion in a very broad and at the same time not in deep this discussion, and we are very grateful for your time with us this night. I wish that this war ends very soon. This is our wish here in Brazil, in our university and our group of professors, and otherwise we are going all to suffer a lot, once more than others, but all the world community is being influenced in our global community by this war, by this sad war, this horrible war that we are watching by TV, by newspapers, and so on. I would like to discuss a little bit more with you about that, but I know that we run out of the time, and I'd like to discuss about social media and about fake news. I think all kind of this influence our democracy here in Brazil and all around the world. But I think we can invite you for coming to Brazil in a very better context, that you can share your knowledge on all the topics that we are interested, and you can be interested in discussing with us. I'm crossing my fingers, but that everything will end very soon. But I'm also very concerned about everything. Okay, thank you so much in the name of all the professors, students, and technical staff, and all the community that are watching your brilliant presentation. And hopefully we can invite you very soon for coming to Brazil. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you. Thank you, Mauro. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.